What's up, all you cool cats and kittens? Are we still saying that? I'm Todd, one of the pastors here, and wherever you're tuning in from, Pittsburgh, El Salvador, South Africa, we're so glad that you're here. Make sure to say hey by clicking the link below or texting Connect to 724-780-0061. Matt and Kate, they've done a great job throughout this series talking about the power of this playlist we find in the Bible called the Psalms. And while some people believe that the best playlist should be all rise, hit after hit after hit, banger after banger, keeping the party going, I'm here to bring you to that breakup song on the playlist. I'm here with that song that everybody at the party looks around and says, who put this on here? We're killing those vibes. We're bringing down the mood as we take a look today at Psalm 42. In the early days of the pandemic, I found myself talking on the phone with a lot of you, and that phrase kept coming up. Some people would say, I know I should trust God. I know I should be able to find the silver lining. I know I should be content, but I'm pretty anxious about my job right now or my business or the health of someone I love. I'm angry that there's no clear end in sight. I'm afraid of how this is going to impact us and for how long. I know I should trust God loves us, but we might not get to see the Penguins extend their dynasty. And those feels for many of us have become much more complicated since. I felt the same, but I found myself saying over and over and over again, I'm not sure it's about how you should feel, but just how you do feel. And I'm not sure where that idea came from, except from reading the Psalms a lot. The Psalms show us that God is less interested in what we should feel and more interested in what we do feel. Some people think God won't give you more than you can handle. The problem with that phrase is, one, that God really isn't the source of most of the things that bring us pain. And two, we were never meant to handle any of this. The Bible essentially tells us that we were never originally meant to handle any pain or trauma or sickness or emotional distress. Humanity simply wasn't built for brokenness. And because we weren't wired for it, our emotional wiring easily gets tangled. Deep down, we yearn for things to be made right, for justice to fix injustice, for healing to fix disease, for harmony to replace division. The way we do feel comes from the tension of the way the world should be. You know, they've actually found studies that say that when you're sad, a sad song actually helps make you happier. They make us feel like we're not so alone anymore, and that we can finally let it out. The ancient Greeks called this catharsis. They'd write these tragic plays, maybe you had to read them in high school, or at least you told your teacher you did, and they existed so that their community could gather and just collectively get it all out. That's what the Psalms help us to do, experience and understand our emotions. The book of Psalms gives us a soundtrack to help us not feel so alone, so weird, so broken. And for almost 3,000 years, people have been using its lyrics to help narrate their human experience. We see this especially in a whole category of songs called lament. Lament is an active process of facing our gritty emotional reactions to the evil in the world, expressing ourselves clearly and authentically, and crying out to God to fix it. You know, like during our traditional Festivus practices, the airing of grievances, it's kind of like that. Many Christian leaders have reminded me recently of the power of this practice at times like this. Activist and preacher Christine Caine said in a recent interview that lament is cautiously, actively longing for something better. In lament, we intellectually, emotionally, and sometimes even tangibly experience the tension of how things are and desperately yearn for what they should be. Psalm 42 illustrates this viscerally. The song begins, "As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When can I go and meet with God?" It's easy to underestimate the feel of this passage. In fact, this passage has famously become kind of a cutesy coffee mug, cross-stitch motivational Instagram post. You get this kind of picture with an idyllic image of Bambi sipping at a stream, a beautiful sunset or silhouette, the kind of sweet, endearing picture you'd find in your grandma's house. By the way, when I was looking through these images, I found one that makes a really good point. Psalm 42 says that deer pants for streams of water. If that's true, how does she wear them? In a world where clean water didn't come from taps, where it took hard labor to gather it from wells or freshwater sources, where droughts and dried streams were common experiences in their Middle Eastern climate, this imagery would have been a little bit more powerful for them. Today, being thirsty just means you want companionship. For them, it was a sign of deep desperation and even imminent death. Survivalist Aaron Ralston, that guy that the 127 Hours movie with James Franco is based on, he described his thirst when he got stuck in a canyon for 5 days with little food and water. Eventually, it led to hallucinations, and he was even so thirsty that he recycled his own fluids, if you know what I mean. He said this in an interview: thirst is such a presence. It drives your body. It's one of those very root instincts your mind has that connects it to your body's needs. The thirst gets heavier and heavier and heavier the longer it goes on. Psalm 42 is meant to connect our memories of our physical desperation to help us get in touch with our existing spiritual desperation. Just as our bodies can't live long without fluids or souls or our identities, our deeper needs dry up and fade away without God's continual provision. For the writer, distinctions between the physical needs and the spiritual needs weren't as separate as we make them today. In the ancient world, how they felt on the outside was displayed by how they felt on the inside. They weren't content just saying it, just putting a comment in God's suggestion box, posting about it on Facebook. They display it. Emotional wailing, tearing their clothes, wearing around potato sacks as shirts, and putting ashes on their heads. It was a dramatic display. And it even became so big that they would hire professional mourners to help enhance their display of grief. I read this week you can actually still hire them if you want your funeral someday to be a little extra. The point is that they let themselves feel their pain so powerfully that they'd want to get it out any way they can, a whole body experience of emotional cleansing, catharsis. By the way, if you've ever felt like your expressions of anger or frustration or lament were a little strange, punching a wall, screaming into a pillow, eating gallons of ice cream, trust me, God's seen it all. In his distress, the writers go on to help accentuate this desperation. They say it this way. He says, "Day and night I have only tears for food, while my enemies continually taunt me, saying, 'Where is this God of yours?' My heart is breaking as I remember how it used to be." Can't you hear the groaning of that survivalist described? Have you said something similar to this recently, especially in that last line? At some times in my life, it's been easy to dismiss these passages as being a little dramatic until you find yourself much closer to where this writer was. When that person, that marriage, that career, that child, we thought would always be there, suddenly gone. When we started seeing the painful experiences of those going through the COVID crisis, overrun hospitals, diagrams of ventilators, the firsthand accounts of those who have had it, especially when someone you love tests positive. We watched the George Floyd video all the way through. We read the stories of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and Elijah McClain. Wrong places, wrong time, wrong skin color. We've all been forced to stare at suffering much more closely these past few months. And we try to look away, of course. We distract ourselves and self-medicate through our normal American ways, binging Tiger King, crashing the liquor store website, picking and choosing and posting the most convenient conspiracy theories or political narratives. One thing I've especially seen are those attempts to just explain it all away with trite sayings or Facebook fake news. Our cultural Christians, unfortunately, have become notorious for this. We love these cliche phrases that help us avoid pain. God's got this. You know, everything happens for a reason. You just need to have enough faith. These are just avoidance strategies, and they're all actually making us gullible because we're desperate to numb the pain that we feel. N.T. Wright is probably the most important living Bible scholar. As Christians especially have tried to explain away the coronavirus or why it's happening, he says this: "It's no part of the Christian vocation than to be able to explain what's happening and why. In fact, it's part of the Christian vocation not to be able to explain and to lament instead. As the Spirit laments within us, so we become, even in our self-isolation, small shrines where the presence and healing love of God could dwell." He goes on to say that Christianity is much more mysterious, much more comfortable and confident in the unknown, in confusion, in darkness than we oftentimes think or imagine. This is actually what I love about ancient, biblically based Christianity. It doesn't try to simplify or dismiss our pain. Instead, it embraces it, and in the process, embraces us. It's not an escape. It's a brutal look into the eyes of evil and a defiant stance against it. And our defiance to the evil in this world starts with lament. In a minute, I'm going to talk more clearly about the purpose and power in a practical way of lamenting. This isn't just wallowing in our sorrows. It's not just letting ourselves mentally spiral. It's not giving in and giving up. It's actually a process of transformation, a gateway from one way of living to another. But one of the biggest mistakes we can make in lament is to jump ahead too quickly. So I want to press pause and listen to me and give you a chance to listen to God and sing along with a modern song of lament. As one person said, worship is the way we bring God into the situation we're lamenting. So take a second. I know it's not fun, but face yourself. What do you need from God right now? What are you thirsty for? Justice, purpose, financial relief, a new job, a vaccine? Get in touch with a myriad of emotions that have probably snowballed in the last few months, and through them, try to get in touch with your God.
Oh, how high I would climb mountains if the mountains were where you hide. Oh, how far scale the valleys if you grace the other side. Oh, how long have I chased rivers, lowly seas to where they rise, against the rush of grace descending from the source of its supply. In the highlands and the heartache, you're neither more or less inclined. I would search and stop in nothing. You're just not that hard to find. I will praise you on the mountain. I will praise
Sometimes we just need a good cry, you know. But lament isn't just about navel gazing and wallowing. No, lament is in the long run about action. Here's the big idea. Lament is processing our pain with God to fully face our suffering, mature ourselves through emotions, and find hope that inspires us. We can't rush too quickly to solutions in lament. It's important that we let it take its time, but that doesn't mean there are no solutions to our suffering. In fact, lamenting is expecting that God will show up even if it feels like he's absent. Here are just a few things I think lament can do for us. One, lament fosters emotional health. Have you ever wondered why marriage fights seem to happen about the most trivial things, or why you snapped at your son the other night over a tiny mess, or why your day off or vacation just feels so, ugh. I was actually on vacation the other day and around other people, outdoors, of course, and was just struck by the bad attitudes, complaining, frustration, the dour faces, and then I realized I'm one of them too. How can our inward reality be so mismatched to such a great outward circumstances? We all have something like this sitting in a drawer or a box somewhere. I pulled this out earlier this week just to look at it. Somehow, when you leave cables alone long enough, they come to life and decide to create this disgusting rat's nest mess. Sometimes it's hard to tell where one cable begins and one ends, and so you set out on this difficult, frustrating journey of untangling it. Otherwise, they're basically unusable or at least super inconvenient. Lament is the long process of untangling and straightening out our confusing emotions, following the line all the way to its source to get the knots out of our heart and our mind so our emotions line up with our reality. And instead of becoming a mess, they become a tool. We follow our emotions all the way to the wounds, to our imperfections, to the root of the real cause of our anxiety, anger, and shame. Reading through the emotional journey of Psalm 42 reminds me of the famous stages of grief. Here's a chart I found that illustrates it. You can trace it from denial to anger to depression to bargaining to acceptance. And can you see maybe where you're at, or maybe a Facebook friend's at, especially when it comes to accepting the pain of your furlough or the reality of COVID-19 or the current conversation around race? If we don't push forward through lament, we can easily get stuck in one of these stages. I think so many of us especially get stuck in denial. Denial is comfortable. It's easy because it doesn't require you to do anything or have responsibility. It doesn't require you to feel anything. We balk at recommendations from health officials because what do they know about masks and immunology? We blame our friends or family members or boss or our ex for the conflict. It's about them, not me. We find every explanation to avoid admitting our own implicit racial biases. And so we make excuses for perpetrators and we blame the victims. It's not really racism that's the problem in America anymore. God and the Psalms endorse every other step in the journey: anger, depression, bargaining. God welcomes all of those emotions. He loves our emotions, not so much our denial. We have to move past denial so we can move with God toward the other side. We can't go around. We can't stop somewhere in the middle. We have to go through. Notice on the other side, you come out a little bit higher than you were before, further along, more mature than when you started. Interestingly, this looks a lot like the journey Matt's been talking about recently, doesn't it? Maybe there's something important in this squiggly shape. In his revolutionary book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, Peter Scazzero makes the convincing argument that emotional maturity is key to spiritual maturity. He writes this: ignoring our emotions is turning our back on reality. Listening to our emotions ushers us into reality, and reality is where we meet God. Emotions are the language of the soul. They are the cry that gives the heart a voice. Emotions play a primary role in our decision-making, our ability to love, and our everyday perception, but many of us like to hide them, to stifle them, to keep them from those that love us, including God. And if we don't expose them, we can't work through them. And that tangled mess in our heart will just come out in all the wrong times, all the wrong ways. We've all been there. That's why counseling is so valuable. In a culture that manipulates our emotions, counselors help us see them for what they are and know how we can learn to live with them and actually leverage them to be a positive tool in our lives. Secondly, lament leads to inspired compassion. Our ability to lament is directly related to our ability to love. If we can't face our own emotions, how can we ever respond to the emotions of others? In fact, the practice of lament was never meant to be an isolated thing. It's something we do together. The same distractions that keep us from our own pain will distract us from the legitimate pain of others. Biblical lament means we don't write off anyone else's pain. We listen to it. We sit with it, we learn from it, and we help find hope in it in a way forward. Lamenting isn't just about you and me, it's about us. It's about something we do together, something we do for others. Remember last month, Matt talked about Habakkuk's cry to God on behalf of others who were hurting. I was talking to a friend the other day who had planted and led a diverse church in Atlanta. It was about 50-50 black and white, and he began to notice a trend. Every time there was a public killing of an unarmed black man or woman, boy or girl, their attendance would drop in half. Almost the entire group of black attenders would disappear that Sunday after. Eventually, they followed up and they found out something heartbreaking. While they loved the church, they didn't yet trust the church to lament with them. Even with black leadership, they had seen so many white people dismiss and ignore their pain. It took me a long time to understand that every time those tragedies happen, black men and women see their own sons' names in the headlines. They see their own daughters in the cell phone video. They see themselves in the pictures on the street. Each tragedy reopens traumatic wounds. So the American church is infamous as being, as many have said, the most segregated hour in America. I've learned recently that the black church exists in America because historically, white Christians had no compassion for their black sisters and brothers. And I think lack of compassion and sympathy is probably why it remains so separated today. Psalm 42 and others show us that the church should be the first place those who are grieving and mourning should be able to find understanding. After explaining that, we don't need to explain everything. N.T. Wright shows us what can happen when we actually lament. He writes this: out of lament, there can emerge new possibilities, new acts of kindness, new scientific understanding, new hope, new wisdom for our leaders even maybe. If we can learn to face and lament our own pain, maybe we can learn to lament with others too. Lament is a key state for God to inspire our compassion and lead us to solutions. Thirdly, lament makes us a lot more like Jesus. Now, don't get me wrong. I believe Jesus was one of the happiest people on the planet, probably the happiest person ever to live. He was always going to parties. He was accused of eating and drinking too much, and with all the wrong people, maybe all the fun people. But he may have also been the saddest of all time, too. Isaiah wrote this heartbreaking description with Jesus in mind. He says he was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with the deepest grief. We turned our backs on him and looked the other way. He was despised, and we did not care. Or take the famous shortest verse of the Bible, responding to the death of a good friend, Lazarus. It says, Jesus wept. Your homework this week is to memorize that verse. Good luck. John goes on to say, people saw his love, his compassion in that moment, but they also saw his anger. Jesus was untangling his emotions as he faced the pain of the world. Moments later, we're told, he would bring Lazarus back to life, but that doesn't mean it wasn't worth lamenting in the moment. Of course, his most devastating moment comes when his own people unjustly took him and nailed him up on a tree, hung him there to suffocate. As he took on the evil of the world, your brokenness and mine, he didn't try to avoid it or explain it away. As he gasps for breath, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He may have known that resurrection was on the way, but that didn't simply dismiss the pain in that moment. He didn't say, God will make this all work out in the end, or maybe God is trying to teach me something. As Jesus faced down his own suffering, the brokenness of the world, the cumulative selfishness of the human race, and as that sat on his shoulders, it muffled the loving voice and presence of God. This might not have been how he was expected, how he was supposed to feel. It just was how he did feel, and the tension of how things are supposed to be. These words weren't actually Jesus' own words. He's quoting lyrics from one of his favorite lament songs, Psalm 22. Resurrection might have been on the way. God might have been on the way, but when we're still waiting, we lament. I love the way one Old Testament scholar said it. Lament literature provides a bottle for the tears of the world. We cry out to God for those who suffer so terribly from the effects of sin and evil and sheer folly and wars and racial conflicts and all manner of injustice and oppression. It holds up to God the sheer horror of what his suffering feels like and appeals to him to act justly, to demonstrate his faithfulness. The lament literature oftentimes lets us dangle in our depression It allows us to feel the feels, to cry the tears, and to get it all out. But almost all the time, lament still ends with desperate hope. That's what happens in Psalm 42. Here's the chorus of that song. Why, my soul, are you downcast? Why so disturbed within me? Put your hope in God, for I will yet praise him, my Savior and my God. Fourthly, lament leads us to Jesus. In lament, we ask because we expect an answer. We search because we expect to find. We thirst because we think there's water somewhere to quench it. I mean, Jesus did say, after all, anyone who is thirsty may come to me. Anyone who believes in me may come and drink. For the scriptures declare, rivers of living water will flow from his heart. They say the same thing in Psalm 42. It says, now I am deeply discouraged, but I will remember you even from the distant Mount Hermon, the source of the Jordan, from the land of Mount Mizar. Quick geography lesson. The Jordan is the primary water source of Israel. Mount Hermon, Mount Mizar, that's where the spring for that river is. He's thirsty and he imagines that hope can spring out of nowhere to feed him and the land. He goes on, I hear the tumult of the raging seas as your waves, surging tides sweep over me. But each day, the Lord pours out his unfailing love upon me. And through each night, I sing his songs, praying to God who gives me life. While our singer feels the deep pain of the broken world around him, God's overwhelming love is springing up and surging. Though he's still thirsty, he remembers, he trusts, and he believes that all hope is never lost. I'm convinced that we actually can't experience the full extent of joy that God has for us until we learn to wade through the depths of lament that our world has forced upon us. When we're thirsty for justice, healing, and for food on the table, let us also learn to be a people that lament until God gives us a drink.